Okay, let's get started, and some others may continue to join. I'm Hamish, I'm CEO at Kazema. Welcome to this webinar about regulatory strategy for market entry to China for drug master files. This is part of our ongoing webinar series of information about China registration of various products. We hope that you find it informative. It's intended to be 30 minutes in duration, including some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm a lawyer by training, by way of introduction. I'm qualified in Australia as well as in Hong Kong, which has been my home for the last 8 years. This is my colleague, Anthony.
Hi, very nice to meet you. My name is Anthony, and I'm the sales director for Kazema, focusing on the US healthcare market. I previously worked for Carl Zeiss, and pleasure to join everybody today for the DMF webinar.
Just a little bit about us so you understand the perspective we are presenting from. We are a regulatory affairs consultancy for China, Greater China, including Hong Kong. We help with the quality assurance, audit, clinical work, and other related quality and compliance services for the market. We were founded by a former German Siemens engineer. He was sent out to China 30 years ago. He founded the company 20 years ago after China joined the WTO. We cover not just drug master files and pharmaceutical products, but also medical device, cosmetics, health foods, and other industrial and consumer goods. Our business is wholly focused on the China market. We speak the language of the customer, whether that's English or Chinese or Japanese, Korean, French, Spanish, German, and we work on the basis of being transparent and responsive and consistent for the market. We have around 100 staff and 12 offices around the world, all focused on China inbound work. So that's a very brief introduction about us. For today's webinar, we are going to take you through in a bite-sized portion of 30 minutes about the DMF market for China. First, there's going to be some broader overview about recent trends, which Anthony's going to introduce in China drug registrations, which relies on the regulatory authorities' annual report relating to 2023, which was issued a few months ago. Then we're going to dive into some more detail around the specific framework for China DMF and some specifics around the filing steps and the authorized rep requirements, finished by some Q&A. With that, Anthony, please take us away about some trends in China drug registration.
Sure. So I'll just briefly cover some regulatory trends that we've seen in the China drug world, starting with the characterization of 2022 as being a rather slow year, where we saw significant lull in NMPA activity, as you can see on this graph, which shows drug applications, NDA, generic drugs, etc. You can see that in 2022 there is quite a dip in terms of the applications requiring technical review, with the exception of generics, which remain strong in that year, and then picking up as we expect in 2023 and into this year. Pretty much everything went back up again in 2023, both in terms of application numbers and applications accepted by the CDE. There's a few notable examples on this slide. For example, IND applications for innovative clinical drugs went up by 30%, 45% for improved new chemical drugs, and NDAs for innovative chemical drugs remarkably by 172%. So this resurgence of activity is clearly borne out in the data. And most proportionate or disproportionately effective were chemical drugs. So you can see the simple bar charts. On the left-hand side, we have traditional Chinese medicine, and then in the middle, chemical drugs, and then on the right-hand side, biologics. You can see that the largest dip in 2022 was for chemical drugs, and I think people attending this webinar are mainly interested in that category. and some further data which you can review later when we send you the slides. Also on a positive note is a more communicative CDE. They have been much more responsive in terms of the volume of applications they've been receiving and the proportion that they've handled to kind of closing the gap with their in-tray, and also in terms of the meetings that they've been holding, so including face-to-face, video calls, teleconferences. So they have been both quantitatively and qualitatively more responsive to people trying to get their DMFs, get their new drugs into China. A few highlight areas here. So this slide shows approval for the drugs most relevant to our viewers, namely innovative or approved chemical drugs, including those that have been marketed in other countries, but not yet in China. And you'll see that in the orange bar for 2023, those are the innovative new drugs not yet marketed in China, again moving up in a very linear fashion. And in terms of the top indications for approvals, we saw that for INDs, those were for anti-cancer, dermatology, ophthalmology, and ENT, which is grouped as one unit in China. Endocrine diseases, primarily diabetes. And then for chemical drug, new drug applications, the indications are similar, but with a slight reordering. So anti-cancer came up top again, but diabetes second, and then digestive system diseases such as IBD coming up in the order, and that kind of reflects the communicable and non-communicable disease burden and the fact that chemical drugs are needed to treat those. Upon request and following this webinar, we will provide some more specific materials that we have drawn up. So firstly, a list of overseas manufactured new drugs with urgent clinical need in China. That includes 75 brand name drugs, as well as a list of pediatric drugs that are encouraged for development and sale eventually in China. And that is a shorter list, including their dosage and route of administration.
Thank you, Anthony. So now we're going to dive into a bit more detail about the framework and the specific steps required to implement your DMF for China.
So before we go into the step-by-step, it's important to know the superstructure. So at the top we have the State Council and beneath the SAMR. Which is now above the NMPA, which was formerly the China FDA or CFDA until it was renamed in 2018. As we do registrations for medical device and also help with DMF, you'll see that the subunits of the NMPA that are involved with DMF applications are the CDE or Center for Drug Evaluation, along with two other subunits just beneath, handling food and drug control as well as food and drug inspection. And again, most of our clients are interested in class 1 and 2 along with class 5.1 and 5.2 type drugs.
And to explain more about them, what are 5.1 and 5.2?
So we are mainly concerned with imported chemical drugs that are either totally new, significantly improved, and that have never been used in China, and you will see those highlighted right at the top. We are not concerned with traditional Chinese medicine, though we have helped some others with biologics, but the biologics category is slightly different from the DMF for chemical drugs.
Yeah, just to supplement, in fact, there is no formal drug master files for biologics suppliers. However, we have supported a number of manufacturers to explore informal pathways so that such suppliers can protect their confidential information vis-a-vis their drug manufacturers in China of the biologic product, And if this is of interest, then please reach out to learn more. But we will concentrate on the formal drug master file framework, which relates to chemical drugs in the rest of the webinar. So just a reminder about the three broad categories of AEP: APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, excipients, and packaging materials. That's AEP. The drug master file consists of confidential and detailed information on the production and quality control of the AAP. This information is submitted to the NMPA and filed in its database, the data from which is later accessed by the NMPA as part of the approval of the end drug product. With this DMF number, the manufacturer or the supplier can retain its confidential information without passing it to the drug manufacturer, and it also can help smooth the drug manufacturer's marketing approval because it only requires the DMF number rather than full dossier to fit with its own marketing application. Here are the three broad pathways for obtaining the drug marketing authorization as supplemented by the drug master files. First of all, we'll scroll to the rightmost column because the binding technical review or BTR is most relevant for most AEP. This enables APIs, excipients, and packaging to be jointly reviewed with the MAH holder awaiting the DMF that makes up the finished drug, along with the approval of the drug and its formative packaging and excipients, and so on. As you can see, if you roll down the slide, the slide is categorized by, first of all, whether it relates to API, excipient, or packaging, then followed by how the filing occurs, and so on. As mentioned with the BTR, this filing is done separately, and then once you obtain the status I or inactive DMF number, the DMF is bound with the end drug product, following which the technical review takes place and the active DMF number or status A is issued. The middle column relates more to generics. That's APIs independently marketed for generic drugs. So it is quite a specific pathway, which we assume won't be as relevant to most attendees here for this webinar. The leftmost column is the pathway whereby all of the subsidiary or supplier information is input into the drug dossier. This, in China at least, used to formerly be the standard pathway, but now APIs generally are required to obtain their DMF in order to submit it as part of the overall MAA. So what are the key filing steps to get your status I and your status A for your DMF product? Here's a broad timeline. The start is to authorize a local rep because the application must be submitted by a Chinese entity. We're going to talk more about the options for such Chinese entity a little bit later. Then there's a checklist or document collection process. In our experience, preparing the dossier and undergoing the gap analysis as against your US drug master file or other jurisdiction takes around 5 months for APIs or 3 months for excipients and packaging. That timeline can be accelerated, and we have accelerated that timeline in repeat scenarios or companies that are quite familiar already with the process. The gap elimination process is also part of this preparation, following which the dossier is finalized and submitted to CDE of NMPA. Then a completeness review or formality review follows to ensure that all the relevant parts are submitted. And immediately thereafter, a status I DMF is issued. This total timeline is around 5 months for excipients and packaging or 8 months for API, based on our experience. A short note that if you pass the completeness review relatively smoothly, then status I for the inactive DMF number is granted in 5 working days. Otherwise, if the completeness review reveals further requests for supplementary information, then you need to resubmit and go through the completeness review to finally get this status I number. After you've got status I, then as we previously showed, the DMF, the inactive DMF number is bound to the end drug product. Follows a first technical review, which takes around 9 to 12 months in our experience. This depends on the drug application itself. So it's the MAA, the MAH of the drug who drives that end timeline. For APIs, there is a test required in China, and that test fee is paid as part of the original submission process. The submission amount of around 30,000 USD includes such test fee. The testing is done by the NIFTC, and we're going to talk about in the next slide what the testing process looks like in a bit more detail. Thereafter, there's a supplementary notice, which will request further information. The manufacturer and then their advisors then will respond to that supplementary notice, submit the further dossier, and undergo a further technical review, which takes another 3 months or so. Finally, technical review is passed and status A for active is granted. The registration in the final row in the column here, the on-site inspection may also be required of the manufacturer, depending on the risk of the API or the overall drug. And 40 days for the end of the review deadline, this all shall be completed. Total timeline is around 20 to 24 months for defining technical review of AEP, or for that matter, of the independent API pathway. What about the test for APIs? Excipients and packaging don't require tests, by the way. First of all, after the submission and technical review, as per previous slide, the API manufacturer, or rather its local agent in China, will receive a test notice. After around 1 week, sample checklists are generally prepared and formulated with the company's advisors before sample delivery is made to the test center itself. In China, for the local agent, then an application to NIFTC is made. This all goes into the total preparation ideal timeline of around 2 to 3 months in our experience. The Diamond past NIFTC test review is the key process, of course, or key step. If yes, then the samples should be sent to NIFTC itself and the sample test started, following which the test report will be transferred from NIFTC directly to an MPA. Or if not, then a supplementary notice will be issued by NIFTC. It may require additional samples or reagents, in which case the sample checklist process and test preparation process begins anew. Otherwise, supplementary materials are submitted, and the second review is undertaken until the NIFTC test review is passed. What about the dossier submission? What does that consist of? Here's a brief outline. The broad message is that the documentation is relatively consistent for API, excipient, and packaging, but APIs require additional information, particularly as it relates to the modules 1, 2, and 3. For example, for our customers, as part of a DMF process, we have specific checklists and templates which we will work through them. And most of this documentation will be familiar to you for your home country jurisdiction application of DMF. It's about testing and finding the gaps and closing those gaps as part of the preparation process. What does the platform look like? Here's an online snapshot. It's in Chinese, of course. but we've provided some translations on the slide. There are specific columns which identify broad general information that is publicly available for your DMF, so this is something to consider and think about. In terms of numbers, number of items that are filed currently with NMPA, there have been 16,500 APIs that have made submission and appear on the database as status I or A, and there are a little over 12,000 which have the status A, that's active. For excipients and packaging, the numbers are a little bit less, and certainly in terms of active, they are less. That's generally because excipients and packaging don't always require a drug master file, and the manufacturer may choose just to give their full production information to the drug manufacturer for them to submit as part of the overall marketing authorization application. Here's a brief snapshot just to make very clear about the status I and status A as it appears on the online database. Fairly clearly, there's an I indicating that the relevant AEP has passed the completeness review and is ready for technical review. On the other hand, status A, of course, means you passed the technical review and finally approved for sale.
So API versus excipients and packaging. Excipients and packaging, the DMF is indefinitely valid, whereas for API, there is a renewal of registration every 5 years. So this is the essential difference between these categories. And of course, people make changes to their formulations, APIs, packaging, excipients, and so other than new registrations of APIs or renewals of APIs that have not undergone any change, suppliers do make changes to their formulations, and so there are major and minor changes that the CDE need to be informed about, be they technical or non-technical. And here are a few examples. So an example of a minor change for an API is a new control or processing method that doesn't affect the purity, changing the supplier of starting materials without changing the synthesis route of those starting materials. An example of a moderate change of an API is changing the reactants, solvents, production conditions, and the process steps before the final reaction. And an example of a major change is relaxing or removing applied quality controls or changing the sterilization or aseptic process of the API. Minor changes can simply be included in the annual report, which is something that Kazema can help you to write. Moderate changes should be made known to the CDE before they're implemented, and then detailed in the annual report. Major changes require a supplementary application to the CDE and cannot actually be implemented without first getting approval, unlike formal lesser changes. Please note that if no technical review is deemed necessary for post-approval changes to an API, that the fee from the CDE for revision is just 10K. But if technical review is needed for a major change, the figure is much higher.
Yeah, and just to supplement, here's a practice point for drug product manufacturers is that they, of course, need to also be aware and responding to and auditing their suppliers to ensure that they are compliant with these relevant requirements around major, moderate, and minor changes for any adjustments to their supplier AEPs.
And of course, people don't only make changes to their APIs, excipients, and packaging, they also change their legal agents and distributors. So we will now discuss this. So foreign manufacturers require legal entity in China for their drug master files, administrative regulatory procedures, communicating with the authorities, and other post-market responsibilities. And essentially, you have three choices: a commercial partner, usually a Chinese, de facto exclusivity, your own subsidiary, or a consulting firm. Those are the three broad choices, and then the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, and in terms of pros and cons, remember that the DMF process is designed to help protect the supplier's IP, but if you use a commercial partner to make the submission, they will receive all this information anyway. So that is a commercial consideration to be aware of and considering. To use a subsidiary in China is the belts and braces approach, but it is not always cost-effective or feasible in the short or medium term. There are also independent third parties. We act in this role for many of our customers. You want to, top tips are to find a third party who does not have distribution or commercial interest for sale of the AEP. And of course, it requires various PMS responsibilities and other regulatory works, which I'll detail in the following slide. Top tips to think about for your local authorized rep are around the regulatory affairs capabilities and the renewals or major, moderate, and minor changes that may need to be implemented and how to go about it, let alone the DMF and accompanying tests for APIs, for example, itself. There's a document management process and procedures that will need to be followed, as well as changes to the framework, the regulatory framework itself, which in China is quite frequent. The bundle technical review is also has some news and communications required with NMPA as part of the process. And there's an annual safety report as well, which needs to be submitted by the relevant AEP manufacturer. The submission is formally made by the local representative. And the account management, there's an online account, which is part of the local rep's role, and this needs to be closely managed as well to ensure compliance. It is possible to change your local authorized rep at any time. That is relatively straightforward, although it makes it much easier if the local rep is compliant with that change and willing with that change. If not, it is still possible, but can be more complicated. And with that, we will finish our webinar there. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.